It was a crisp, chilly morning in late autumn when the unthinkable happened. The world woke up to a headline that nobody saw coming. Trump fakes homelessness to sneak into local hospital. Here's why. How could this be true? Was it some kind of prank or a wild rumor? The news spread like wildfire, and everyone had their own theories. The tabloids ran wild. The internet exploded with memes, and social media went into full meltdown. Was this the latest publicity stunt? Or was there something deeper happening here? But as people speculated, one thing became clear. This wasn't just another Trump headline. No, this was something different. Something personal. Something that would force even the most hardened critics to take a step back and reconsider everything they thought they knew about him. Why would he do this? Was the question on everyone's lips. How could someone who once held the highest office in the land, a man known for his wealth, power, and fame, suddenly pretend to be homeless? The answer, it turned out, was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. It started in the dead of night, in the shadows of a life few had ever seen. Donald Trump, now just a regular man walking among the masses, knew his time was running out. He couldn't hide forever, not with the situation he was facing. There was a need, a desperate need, that had pushed him to do something completely out of character, to do the unthinkable. He didn't care about the media anymore. He didn't care about his former colleagues, the fans, or the haters. No, he cared about one thing: survival. But survival meant blending in, becoming invisible. It meant stepping into the crowd, walking amongst those whose faces and names the world had forgotten. He needed to disappear, even if it was just for a while. And the only way to do that was to shed the man everyone thought they knew. Under the cover of darkness, Trump left his luxurious residence, which now felt like a prison rather than a sanctuary. He left behind the security guards, the lavish amenities, and even his beloved gold-plated fixtures. It wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about the fame or the brand. It was about what came next, and for that, he had to become someone else. With nothing but the clothes on his back, he set off into the streets of Manhattan, unnoticed by the world that had once adored him. The billionaire mogul turned former president was now an ordinary man, walking alone in the cold, his eyes scanning the street as he approached the destination he had been planning for weeks. The hospital. No one would expect Donald Trump, of all people, to be seeking medical treatment, especially under the guise of a homeless person. But Trump wasn't after regular medical care. What he was after went much deeper than that. It wasn't about illness or injury. It wasn't about what people would expect from a former world leader. Trump had a personal problem, a deep-seated issue that couldn't be solved by his usual entourage of doctors, experts, or friends. He had something much more serious to face. Before we continue, don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning for all of us. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? As the hospital loomed ahead, Trump couldn't help but reflect on how far he had fallen. How did he go from being one of the most powerful men in the world to this, and more importantly, how would he survive the next few hours in a world where no one knew who he was? It was the beginning of an unexpected journey, one that would change everything he thought he knew about power, vulnerability, and what it really means to be human. For most of his life, Donald Trump was a man who didn't know the meaning of the word lack. Born into wealth and privilege, he grew up in a towering mansion in Queens, New York. His father, Fred Trump, was a successful real estate developer, and his mother, Mary McLeod, was a Scottish immigrant with a sharp sense of discipline. From a young age, Donald was groomed to take over the family business. He attended the best schools, including the prestigious Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, where he earned a degree in economics. By his 20s, he had already taken the helm of his father's real estate empire, rebranding it under the Trump name, and setting off on his own meteoric rise. New York City became his playground, and he was determined to dominate it. His name became synonymous with luxury. He built skyscrapers that pierced the skyline, opened casinos that drew crowds from around the world, and branded everything from hotels to steaks. Trump's face adorned magazine covers, and his voice echoed on the radio. There was no doubt he was a force to be reckoned with. But behind the scenes, a different reality existed. Trump's life wasn't without its struggles. His path to success was littered with personal and professional battles. Behind the gleaming buildings and the iconic gold-plated elevators was a man who had lost marriages, endured lawsuits, and faced public humiliation time and again. His first two marriages had ended in divorce, Ivana Trump in the 1990s, and later Marla Maples, the mother of his daughter Tiffany. Each divorce took a toll, both personally and in the public eye, but Trump always bounced back, as if it were part of the game. Then came his run for president in 2016. It was an unprecedented move for someone with no political experience, but for Trump, it was just another challenge to conquer. His campaign was divisive, chaotic, and controversial, but against all odds, he won the election. He became the 45th president of the United States, a title that many thought he could never achieve. Yet, as always, he proved the doubters wrong. For 4 years, Trump wielded power like no one before him. His decisions reshaped the country, and his policies sparked passionate debates. He was a lightning rod for both adulation and anger. But no matter the controversy, Trump always remained resolute. He believed that no matter the odds, he could outlast anything thrown his way. But then came the end of his presidency and the fallout that followed. Losing the 2020 election to Joe Biden was a blow that Donald Trump wasn't prepared for. While his supporters rallied around him, accusing the election of being stolen, Trump himself retreated into a kind of denial. The loss was not just political, it was personal. For the first time in decades, he felt the sting of defeat. Once the bright star of American politics, Trump found himself at odds with his own supporters and allies. The insurrection on January 6, 2021, marked a turning point in his post-presidency. While he never took responsibility for the events of that day, the stain on his reputation was undeniable. But what really pushed him to the brink, what truly unsettled him, wasn't the legal battles or the constant media scrutiny. It was the realization that he was no longer the man who could command a room, the man whose voice carried weight, the man who could control the narrative. He was just another old man, fighting to maintain relevance in a world that had moved on without him. It wasn't long before the cracks in Trump's life became impossible to ignore. His private battles with health, strokes, stress, and an increasing sense of mortality began to take their toll. In the face of declining health, Trump's once indomitable confidence began to falter. He found himself grappling with fears that, for the first time in his life, he could not control the outcome. Then, there was the loneliness. His former political allies, now distanced, seemed like distant echoes. His children were busy with their own lives, and the only real constant in his world was the memory of his past victories. But in the quiet moments, when the cameras were off and the crowds dispersed, Trump couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, a connection he couldn't name, a sense of purpose he couldn't reclaim. It wasn't just the physical strain. It was a crisis of identity. What did he really stand for, now that the stage had changed? In the midst of this turmoil, Trump received news that would alter the course of his life forever. He had a health issue, something that couldn't be hidden or ignored. But rather than seek the traditional medical treatment or confide in his closest allies, he made a decision that shocked everyone. Trump would enter the hospital, not as Donald Trump, the former president, but as a nobody, a homeless man. Why? Because he needed to escape. He needed to disappear. In that moment, the idea of being anonymous, of being just another person, was the only way he could find peace. A strange irony, one that a man who had spent his entire life in the spotlight would now seek refuge in complete obscurity. And so, under the cover of darkness, Donald Trump began to plot his plan. He knew it was risky. He knew it could backfire. But something told him that in order to heal, to understand who he had become, he needed to lose everything first. As Trump prepared to go undercover in the streets of New York, he reflected on his journey. It wasn't just about his health or the public's perception of him. It was about confronting the truth, about stepping away from the image he had so carefully crafted for decades and learning what it truly meant to be human again. The hospital would be his new battleground. And as he took his first steps toward the unknown, he couldn't help but wonder, would this be his rebirth or the final act in a life that had been defined by excess and spectacle? The heavy doors of the hospital swung open, and Donald Trump stepped inside, though no one would have recognized him. He wasn't the former president of the United States anymore. He wasn't a businessman or a celebrity. He was just another man, an ordinary, homeless man who was about to undergo one of the strangest transformations of his life. The fluorescent lights flickered above him, casting a cold, sterile glow over everything. The bustling sounds of the hospital's emergency room hit his ears. Doctors barking orders, nurses rushing between patients, the occasional cry of someone in pain. Trump took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had been in hospitals countless times before, but never like this. Never in this disguise. He moved quietly past the reception desk, his hands shoved into the pockets of the oversized jacket he had picked up from a thrift store earlier in the day. His clothes, worn, faded jeans, and an old hoodie, were a far cry from the tailored suits and power ties he was used to wearing. But that was the point. He had to become invisible. "Can I help you?" The receptionist's voice was polite, but her eyes flickered with judgment, as they often did when someone from the streets wandered in. Trump tried to steady his breathing. I need to see a doctor," he mumbled, his voice rougher than usual. The words felt foreign, and for a moment, he considered backing out. But then he remembered why he was here: to disappear, to survive, to heal in a way that wouldn't expose him to the public or the cameras. The receptionist didn't ask any more questions. It was a standard procedure. He handed her a form, which he fumbled with, pretending to read it. The form felt like an absurdity. He had filled out countless forms in his life, but this was different. There was no name, no title, just a blank space where a man's identity should have been. He looked down at the form for a moment, thinking, "What's your name?" The question hit him harder than he expected. Who was he now? Not the man who had once commanded the world's stage. Not the billionaire mogul. Not the president. Just a man who needed help. As the receptionist processed his information, Trump felt a pang of frustration. This was supposed to be a temporary escape, a chance to find some relief, but already, the reality of his decision was setting in. He could feel the eyes of the other patients in the waiting room. A few people glanced at him, some with pity, others with disdain, but none of them recognized him. He wasn't Trump anymore. He was invisible. For a moment, he let himself sink into the anonymity. It was a strange, almost liberating feeling. For years, he had been hounded by the media, followed by photographers, surrounded by an army of people who knew him, knew his name, knew his every move. Here, no one cared who he was. Yet, that anonymity came with its own set of challenges. As he waited for his turn to be seen by a doctor, the other patients began to make small talk with him. It was the first time in years he had been forced to interact with people who weren't vying for his approval, or looking for a deal, or seeking a photo op. These were people who had their own battles that didn't involve millions of dollars or political power. One of them, a man with a scruffy beard and ragged clothes, asked Trump how long he'd been out on the streets. "I'm not sure," Trump replied, his voice low. "A couple of weeks, maybe." The man nodded, as if he understood, though Trump knew it was a lie. He had only just arrived. But the words were easy to say. In that moment, it felt better to blend in, to lie and pretend. The truth would have been too much, too revealing. As the man spoke about his own struggles, his time in prison, his battles with addiction, Trump began to feel a shift inside, a realization that he hadn't expected. These people, these strangers, were just like him in some ways. They had faced their own challenges, their own defeats, and yet they still carried on. But as Trump listened to the man's story, something else gnawed at him. Was he really like them? No, he wasn't. Trump had never truly been one of them. Not really. Even in his lowest moments, he had always had something others didn't: money, power, influence. He could always buy his way out of trouble. Even now, with all his wealth and status stripped away, he still had an aura about him that others couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about the suit. It was about how people saw him, how they used to see him. That realization stung, more than he cared to admit. As the minutes ticked by, Trump found himself struggling to keep his mind focused. His anxiety flared as his mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios. What if someone recognized him? What if the media got wind of his whereabouts? What if this whole thing was a mistake? But then, Just as quickly as the panic began to rise, something else took hold of him. Maybe I can survive this. Maybe I can find a way out. Maybe this will work. Finally, Trump was called into an examination room. A nurse led him through the sterile hallways, her face impassive as she made small talk. She asked him routine questions about his health, but Trump barely paid attention. He was too focused on the internal war raging in his mind. When they reached the examination room, Trump sat down on the paper-covered table, feeling a strange sense of relief. There were no cameras here, no press conferences, no speeches to give. Just him and this unknown nurse, someone who didn't care who he was. That, for some reason, was exactly what he needed. The nurse asked him to change into a hospital gown, and as he undressed, Trump looked at himself in the mirror. For the first time in a long time, he didn't see the image of Donald Trump, the billionaire, or the former president. He saw a man, vulnerable, flawed, and human. It was a disorienting feeling. As the nurse returned and began taking his vitals, Trump's mind wandered. What had brought him to this point? Was it the loss of power? The health scare? Or something deeper? Something about his own identity that he had never fully understood? Before he could fully contemplate this question, the door opened and a doctor walked in. It was time for the real reason he had come here. But as Trump prepared to face his medical tests, a nagging thought hung over him. Would this be enough to heal him? Or was he just running from the real problem? Trump sat on the sterile hospital bed, the soft sound of the heart monitor beeping steadily in the background. The room was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the hall outside. But inside his mind, a storm raged. This wasn't just about a physical ailment. This was about something much larger, something that had been quietly eating at him for years. The weight of his decision to come here, dressed as a homeless man, hiding his identity, was beginning to sink in. The hospital room felt suffocating, despite its cold, clinical walls. Here, in the quiet of the night, Trump was alone with his thoughts. What did he expect to find? The question echoed through his mind. Was this an act of self-destruction or a desperate search for redemption? He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was past midnight. The doctors had run their tests, the nurses had come and gone, but Trump couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something deeper was calling him, something he had buried for years. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, the door to the room opened quietly, and a new figure entered. A woman in her early 30s, with short black hair and a tired, yet kind expression. She was one of the hospital's social workers, someone tasked with looking after the less fortunate patients. Trump had been briefly introduced to her earlier in the day, but they hadn't spoken much beyond pleasantries. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, glancing at the clipboard in her hands. "How are you feeling?" He blinked, momentarily disoriented. He had been using the name Thompson to avoid suspicion, though it felt strange now. The man in the mirror, the man named Thompson, seemed like a completely different person, someone who didn't have a legacy or a past that followed him everywhere. "I'm okay," Trump replied, his voice flat. He shifted uncomfortably on the bed, just waiting to see what's next. She nodded, understanding more than he realized. "I know it's hard," she said. "Sometimes people come here, and they feel invisible. You know, like the world's just moving on without them. But you're not alone here, Mr. Thompson. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." Trump's throat tightened. He wasn't used to people talking to him like this. Not with such openness, not with such raw empathy. He had spent most of his life being surrounded by yes-men and sycophants, people who told him what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to hear. But in this hospital, he had nothing. No title, no wealth, no empire. Just a man. And this woman, this stranger, was speaking to him in a way that made him feel seen. For the first time in what felt like years, a crack appeared in the armor he had built around himself. He wanted to say something, to ask for help, to express the feeling that had been growing in his chest ever since he arrived. But the words felt foreign. Instead, he simply nodded and forced a smile. "I'm just figuring things out," he said. The woman, whose name was Maria, seemed to sense his hesitation. She pulled up a chair beside his bed and sat down, glancing at the hospital chart on her clipboard. "You know, Mr. Thompson," she said thoughtfully, We've had a lot of people come through here. Some people are homeless by choice, but others, they're running from something. Running from something in their past, or something that's still haunting them. You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready, but I want you to know that there's no shame in seeking help. You're here for a reason, and maybe you're ready to confront whatever it is that brought you here. Trump's heart raced as her words hit him harder than he expected. Running from something, was that what he was doing? Was he running from the past, from the wreckage of his former life, from the decisions he regretted, the losses he had suffered? He thought back to the years before the presidency, the years of making and losing fortunes, of divorce and scandal. He had been on top of the world, and then suddenly, it all felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse. Maybe it was the election loss, or the scandals, or the personal betrayals. Whatever it was, he knew that his life had become a carefully constructed illusion, and now it was all crumbling. Maria's voice broke through his thoughts. It's okay to feel lost. It's okay to not have all the answers. But don't stay stuck. You deserve more than that. Trump turned his head, looking at her with a mixture of disbelief and surprise. He deserved more than that? He had always been the one who gave answers, who controlled the narrative. It was an unsettling feeling to be on the other side, to be the one in need of help. The realization hit him like a cold splash of water. He had spent so many years fighting to stay on top, fighting to maintain control, fighting to be right, that he had forgotten what it felt like to just be human. I don't know if I can fix everything, he said quietly, almost to himself. You don't have to fix everything, Maria replied, her voice gentle but firm. You just have to start. Even a small step forward is still progress. For the first time in a long time, Trump felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he could start over. Maybe this moment, this painful moment, could be the turning point he had been waiting for. It wasn't too late to change. It wasn't too late to confront the ghosts of his past and find something worth living for again. Maria stood up, ready to leave him to his thoughts. I'll check in on you tomorrow, she said with a reassuring smile. But don't be afraid to reach out. We're all in this together. Trump watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her. He sat there for a long time, thinking, what did he want? He knew now that he couldn't keep running forever. He had to face his past, his failures, his regrets, the broken relationships. The man who had once tried to control the world couldn't keep running from himself. The hospital wasn't just a place to hide. It was a place to heal, to reflect, and maybe, just maybe, a place to begin again. The hospital room felt quieter now, the hum of the fluorescent lights above almost deafening in its stillness. Trump lay back on the bed, his eyes closed, his mind racing. He had spent the last few days in this liminal space, half in reality, half in a world of his own thoughts. The physical pain that had brought him here was one thing, but the emotional toll was far heavier. And despite all his wealth, his power, and his former influence, none of it could shield him from what was coming. He had tried to avoid it. He had told himself that the pain in his chest was just a physical ailment, maybe stress, maybe just a consequence of age. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about his body. It wasn't just about his health. It was about everything else. The regrets, the missed opportunities, the years of isolation that had led him to this point. Trump had always been in control, or so he thought. He had shaped his world, made his own rules, and fought for everything he had. But in the quiet of this hospital room, there was no escaping the truth. There was no audience, no crowd cheering him on, no advisors telling him what to do. There was just him, and the man he had become. The truth was simple, yet devastating. He had lost himself. He had built an empire, but in doing so, he had lost the very things that made him human. The friendships, the love, the connections. Everything had been sacrificed in the name of ambition. And now, in this sterile room, he was forced to confront the aftermath of that decision. He was forced to confront the loneliness that had been creeping up on him for years. Just as Trump was beginning to process this realization, the door to his room opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was Maria, the social worker. She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts concern and understanding. "Mr. Thompson, how are you doing?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. Trump met her gaze, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't have an answer. He wanted to tell her everything, that he was falling apart inside, that he was scared, that he didn't know what to do next. But the words wouldn't come. Maria seemed to sense his hesitation. She sat down in the chair next to his bed, her posture relaxed but attentive. You don't have to say anything if you're not ready. But I just want you to know, whatever you're feeling, whatever you're going through, it's okay to feel that way. The vulnerability in her voice cracked something inside him. Trump's chest tightened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, his carefully constructed walls began to crumble. You don't understand, he muttered, his voice shaking. I've had everything, and now I don't have anything. Maria sat quietly for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. Then, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. Maybe that's the problem, she said gently. Maybe you've been so focused on what you've had that you've forgotten what you need. Trump's heart raced as her words sank in. She was right. He had spent his entire life chasing more money, more power, more fame. He had never stopped to ask himself what he actually needed, what he actually wanted. He had built a tower of success, but in the process, he had left everything else behind. And now, in this hospital bed, all that was left was the wreckage of his choices. Maria didn't push him further. Instead, she let him sit with the words. The quiet in the room was thick with emotion, the weight of Trump's internal battle palpable. He felt exposed, raw, vulnerable. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, not since his early days in business, when he had been a man with dreams and no guarantees. I don't know what to do, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could control everything, but now, I don't know who I am anymore. Maria gave him a soft smile, her eyes filled with empathy. It's okay. It's okay to not have all the answers. You don't have to figure it all out right now. You're already on the path to healing. The first step is just acknowledging that you need something different. And that's where it starts. Trump's chest tightened as the truth of her words settled in. He had been so focused on winning, on building his empire, on making sure the world knew his name, that he had forgotten what it meant to simply live, to connect with people, to be present, to care about more than just power and control. It was all starting to make sense now, the connection he had been missing. It wasn't about running away from his past. It was about finding a way to rebuild, to restore what had been lost. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. He had spent his life trying to bend the world to his will. But now, as he lay there in that hospital bed, he realized that the real challenge was learning to live with the world as it was, and learning to find peace within himself. For the first time in days, Trump felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a grand revelation, not a sudden burst of clarity, but it was something. A realization that, while he couldn't change the past, he could still shape the future. It wasn't too late. There was still time to heal. Maria stood up, her expression warm and encouraging. Take it one day at a time, Mr. Thompson. I'll be here to help you however I can. As she left the room, Trump lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The hospital was still a place of uncertainty, a place where everything had started to unravel. But it was also a place of reflection, a place where he could begin to put the pieces of his life back together. Maybe he had lost everything, but that didn't mean he was done. There was still a chance to find himself again, to rediscover what truly mattered. He didn't need power, or wealth, or the title of president. He needed something far more important: peace, connection, and the chance to build something real. The days in the hospital were beginning to blur together. Each morning, Trump woke up to the same sterile white walls, the soft beep of the machines, and the faint sound of distant chatter. But something had changed in him. He no longer felt like a stranger in this place. The hospital, which had once seemed like a cold, impersonal setting, was now a space where he could breathe, even if only for a moment. Trump wasn't sure when it happened exactly, but over the last few days, he had begun to feel a shift inside. The constant pressure, the unrelenting need to keep up appearances, had started to lift. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. But in that vulnerability, there was also a quiet strength. It was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time, maybe ever. As much as he hated to admit it, the hospital was the perfect place for him to confront the reality of his situation. It wasn't just about health, it was about his life. The decisions he had made, the people he had hurt, the opportunities he had missed, it all came rushing back in waves. But this time, instead of running from those feelings, he was facing them head-on. He had spent so much of his life being the one in control, the one who made the rules, who dictated the narrative. But now, he was at the mercy of the world, surrounded by people who didn't care about his past, his title, or his wealth. They were just people, nurses, doctors, aides, strangers, treating him like any other patient. And somehow, that felt more real than anything he had experienced in years. It was Maria who had first made him realize that he wasn't just a patient. She had opened his eyes to something he hadn't truly considered before: human connection. Up until this point, Trump had seen people as tools, as means to an end. He had used people for his own gain, manipulated situations to his advantage. But Maria had made him realize that there was something more important than all of that. That night, after another long day of tests and checkups, Maria returned to his room, her usual kind smile on her face. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," she said warmly, sitting in the chair next to his bed. "How are you feeling today?" Trump took a deep breath, looking out the window at the faint glow of the city skyline. "I'm different," he said slowly. "I don't know how to explain it, but something's changed. I'm not the same man who walked in here a few days ago." Maria gave him a thoughtful look. "That's a big realization," she said quietly. "Sometimes, we have to hit rock bottom to realize who we really are. But the important thing is what we do after that." Trump nodded, his gaze still fixed on the view outside. "I've spent my life chasing something: power, wealth, status. I thought I needed all of those things to be somebody. But now I'm not so sure. I'm not sure what I need anymore. But I know it's not what I thought." Maria smiled gently, her eyes full of understanding. "It's a big shift, but it's a good one. You're learning that the things that matter the most in life aren't the ones that you can measure with money or power. It's about the people you've helped, the relationships you've built, the ways you've made a difference in the world." Trump let out a heavy sigh. "But I've lost so much. I've hurt people along the way. I've burned bridges. I've alienated those who cared about me." Maria reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "It's never too late to rebuild, but it has to start with you. You have to forgive yourself first. Only then can you move forward and make amends with others." The words hit him harder than he expected. Forgive yourself. It sounded so simple, yet so impossible. For years, Trump had believed that his actions were justified, that the end always justified the means. But now, sitting in this hospital bed, he wasn't so sure. He had spent his life trying to control everything around him, but he had never taken the time to understand himself, to confront the deeper truths within him. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his past mistakes. The broken relationships, the lies, the betrayals, the lost opportunities. It all came flooding back in an overwhelming rush. He had hurt so many people, people who had trusted him, loved him, believed in him. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to start over. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But the road to redemption, to healing, had to begin with accepting responsibility and learning to let go of the anger and bitterness that had held him captive for so long. Trump glanced over at Maria, who was still sitting quietly beside him. She had been more of a guide to him than anyone in the past few days. A stranger, yet someone who had shown him more empathy and kindness than he had received from many of his closest allies. "You're right," Trump said quietly, his voice filled with a new sense of humility. "It starts with me. I have to forgive myself if I ever want to move forward." Maria gave him a soft, encouraging smile. "It's a good first step, Mr. Thompson. And the rest? It will come in time. But don't rush it. Let yourself heal." As Maria left the room that evening, Trump lay back in his bed, staring up at the ceiling once more. The weight of his thoughts felt different now, less heavy, somehow. Maybe it was the first flicker of hope he had felt in a long time. Maybe it was the beginning of a new chapter in his life. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to close his eyes without the usual anxiety, or the constant pressure of being on. He had learned, in these last few days, that true peace didn't come from control. It came from acceptance. Acceptance of his past, his mistakes, and his humanity. It was going to be a long journey, rebuilding his life, making amends, and finding his way again. But for the first time, Trump felt like he was ready. It was early morning when the door to Trump's hospital room creaked open, and for a moment, Trump didn't know what to expect. His mind was still clouded with the realization that his life had been one big game of control, and now, the game was coming to an end. For the first time in years, he was sitting still, reflecting on the very things he had spent a lifetime avoiding. But as the door opened, his eyes widened in surprise. Standing there, framed by the doorway, was a figure from his past. Someone who hadn't been part of his life for years. It was Claire, his ex-wife. Trump had not expected her to show up here, of all places. She had been one of the first people to walk away from him after everything had unraveled. They had divorced in a bitter, public spectacle. He had thought she would never speak to him again, and yet here she was, standing in front of him, her face a mixture of concern, hurt, and something else, perhaps hope. "Claire," he said, his voice catching slightly. It felt strange to speak her name after so much time apart. "What are you doing here?" She took a step into the room, her eyes soft but steady. "I heard about what happened. I figured I should come see for myself." Trump nodded slowly, unsure of how to proceed. The last time they had spoken, it hadn't ended well. In fact, their parting had been filled with words that stung even now. But now, in this hospital bed, everything seemed different. There were no lawyers, no public relations strategies. It was just him and her. "I didn't think you'd want to see me," Trump said, looking down at his hands, suddenly feeling like the frail man he had become, vulnerable and exposed. Claire crossed her arms but didn't say anything at first. The silence hung between them like a heavy fog. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You know, for a long time, I thought you were untouchable, that nothing could hurt you. But then, everything fell apart. You couldn't even see it coming, could you? You pushed everyone away. Your family, your friends, your supporters. But most of all, you pushed me." Trump winced at the truth in her words. He had never allowed himself to admit how much he had hurt her. He had been so wrapped up in his own world of success and power, thinking that those things would somehow keep everything else intact. But they hadn't. Nothing had. I was wrong, Claire," he said, his voice low. "I was so focused on winning, on being the best, that I lost sight of everything else. I lost you, and I lost myself." Claire's expression softened slightly. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she moved closer, taking a seat in the chair beside his bed. Her gaze fixed on him, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said softly, the words hanging heavy in the air. "But I'm here because you're trying. You've finally started to see what you've done. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to start over. Not with me, but with yourself." Trump felt a knot form in his throat. She was right. He had done so much damage to their relationship and to so many others. There was no undoing the hurt. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild something. If not with her, then at least within himself. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Trump said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to change. I need to change." Claire nodded, her expression soft but resolute. "That's the first step, but it's only the first." After Claire left, Trump sat alone in his room, reflecting on their conversation. There was a rawness to it, a truth that he could no longer escape. For so many years, he had ignored the damage he was causing to the people around him. His family, his friends, even his employees. Everything had been about the pursuit of more. More power, more recognition, more wealth. But now, he saw the cost of that obsession. It had cost him his humanity. Trump had spent so many years convincing himself that he had to be strong, that he couldn't show weakness. He had built his persona around being untouchable, someone who couldn't be hurt, couldn't be defeated. But the reality was much different now. He was human, and humans made mistakes. He thought about the people he had hurt, the relationships he had destroyed. There was Claire, of course, but there were also the countless others who had fallen by the wayside in his pursuit of success. His children, his closest friends, even his own supporters. In his quest to be the greatest, he had forgotten what truly mattered. And now, those people were gone. Trump's mind wandered to his children, his son, Don Jr., and his daughter, Ivanka. They had always looked up to him, but had they ever really seen him? Had they seen the man behind the public persona? Or had they only seen the figure he wanted them to see? The following day, Trump made a decision. He would reach out to them, not as the former president, not as the businessman, but as their father. It was the first time in years that he had allowed himself to feel that kind of vulnerability, and it was terrifying. He picked up the phone in his hospital room and dialed Ivanka's number. "Hey, it's Dad," he said when she picked up. He paused, unsure of what to say next. The words felt foreign in his mouth. I need to talk to you. Can you come to see me?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ivanka had always been his strongest supporter, but even she had distanced herself in the wake of his downfall. "Of course, Dad," she said softly. "I'll be there soon." As Trump hung up the phone, he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to control the conversation. He wasn't trying to manipulate the situation. He was just being honest, asking for what he needed. And in that moment, he realized something important. Change wasn't about big gestures or grand plans. It was about the small steps, the willingness to face the consequences of his actions, to take responsibility, and to begin making things right. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Trump felt ready to walk it. Trump's heart raced as he sat up in his hospital bed, looking out the window. The light of the setting sun reflected off the glass, casting a warm, almost nostalgic glow on everything. He'd always been someone who kept his emotions tightly guarded, especially with his children. But today was different. Today, he was going to try something he hadn't done in years: be vulnerable. He didn't know what to expect when Ivanka arrived, but he knew this was his chance to make things right. He had to at least try. The door opened softly, and there she was. Ivanka, his daughter, the one person who had been closest to him for so long, even when the rest of the world had turned their backs. She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the sterile environment before settling on him. Her expression was cautious, but there was something else there, too. A softness, a tenderness that hadn't been there when they last spoke. "Dad," Ivanka said, her voice steady but warm. "You look better." Trump smiled, though it felt forced. "I'm getting there. Slowly, but I'm getting there." She nodded and took a seat beside his bed, her gaze softening. "I'm glad you're okay. But we need to talk, don't we?" Trump swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Yeah, I think we do." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ivanka studied him carefully, and Trump felt as though she were looking right through him, as if she could see the full extent of his guilt. His hands fidgeted with the blanket covering his legs, his mind racing with everything he wanted to say but wasn't sure how. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Ivanka, I know I've failed you. I know I've failed your brothers, and I've failed our family. All this time, I thought I could fix everything with power, with control, with money. But I couldn't. I couldn't even keep my own family together." Ivanka's face remained neutral, but her eyes softened. She didn't interrupt, giving him the space to speak. "I wasn't there for you when you needed me most," Trump continued, his throat tightening. "I was so wrapped up in myself, in my own world, that I didn't see what was happening right in front of me. And I hurt you. And I hurt your brothers. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Ivanka took a deep breath, and for a moment, Trump thought she might say something cutting, something filled with the resentment he feared had been building for years. But instead, she said quietly, "You hurt us, Dad. You hurt us by not being there, by pushing us away when we needed you most. But I don't think you really understood the damage you were doing. Not until now." Trump closed his eyes, feeling the sting of her words. The years of ignoring their emotional needs, the years of focusing on business deals, headlines, and tweets instead of their feelings. It all came crashing down on him. "I didn't understand," he admitted. I thought I was doing what was best for you. I thought that by building an empire, I was giving you everything you could ever want. But I missed the one thing that mattered most, the relationship, the love, the connection. Ivanka reached out and placed a hand on his. You were always good at building things, Dad, she said softly. But you didn't build us the way you built your businesses. Relationships aren't about control or power. They're about understanding, being there when it matters. I know you didn't mean to hurt us, but you did. Trump nodded, tears welling in his eyes. It was a humbling moment. This wasn't just about admitting mistakes. It was about acknowledging that he had caused pain he couldn't undo. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. The silence in the room felt heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with understanding, with the possibility of rebuilding what had been broken. Ivanka wasn't ready to forgive him entirely, but she was willing to listen. That, to Trump, was a huge step. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Ivanka, Trump said, his voice breaking slightly, but I want to try. I want to be a better father to you, and to Dawn, and to everyone I've hurt. I can't change the past, but I can change the future. I can be there for you. I can listen. I can be present. Ivanka's expression softened further, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Trump saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. I don't know what the future holds, Ivanka said slowly, but I do know that I'm willing to try. We can start with baby steps. It's not going to be easy, but we can rebuild, piece by piece. Trump smiled through his tears. I'll take it, he said quietly. After Ivanka left, Trump sat back in his bed, exhausted but filled with a strange sense of peace. The conversation with her had been painful, but it had also been necessary. He had taken the first step toward healing, and that felt like a victory, no matter how small. But there was still Don Jr. He had to face him, too. Trump hadn't spoken to his son in months. After the public fallout, Don Jr. had distanced himself, understandably angry at his father's actions during the final years of his presidency and the subsequent chaos that had ensued. Trump knew it wasn't going to be easy, but it was the next step. He had to reach out to his son, as painful as it might be. He picked up the phone again, his hand trembling slightly as he dialed Don Jr.'s number. Hey, Dad, Don Jr. said, his voice cautious, almost guarded. Don, it's me, Trump replied. I need to talk to you. Can you come see me? There was a pause, a long silence that felt like it stretched for hours. Finally, Don Jr. spoke, his voice rough around the edges. I don't know, Dad. Things are complicated, but I'll come. We'll talk. Trump's heart swelled with a mix of relief and fear. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. Trump's mind buzzed with anticipation and regret as he sat in the sterile hospital room, staring at the phone in his hands. His conversation with Ivanka had been difficult but eye-opening, a step forward in a long, difficult process of rebuilding trust. But now, the real challenge awaited. Don Jr. Their relationship had always been a complex one, filled with pride, competition, and unspoken expectations. Trump had always seen Don Jr. as the heir apparent, the one who could carry on his legacy. But in doing so, he had placed an incredible amount of pressure on him. Don Jr. had tried to follow in his father's footsteps, but the cracks in their relationship had widened over the years, especially after the presidency. The public fallout, the family feuds, it all culminated in months of silence. Now, sitting alone in his hospital room, Trump felt the weight of that silence. He hadn't spoken to Don Jr. since the day everything had crumbled, and he knew their first conversation in months wouldn't be easy. He couldn't afford to let this chance slip away. Finally, he made the call. The phone rang twice before Don Jr. picked up, his voice more guarded than Trump had ever heard it. Yeah, Dad, Don Jr. said, his tone distant but not hostile. It was the tone of someone who had been hurt too many times to believe words would fix anything. Trump cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. Don, I need to see you. I know things have been rough between us, but I want to make things right. Can you come? There was a long pause. Trump could almost hear Don Jr. weighing the decision in his head, his emotions a swirl of anger, disappointment, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of hope. "I'll be there," Don Jr. said, before hanging up without another word. Trump's chest tightened. He had no idea what to expect. Don Jr. had always been the one to act tough, to keep his feelings hidden. But now, Trump understood that it wasn't toughness. It was pain. Pain that had been building for years, and Trump was the source. Later that afternoon, Don Jr. walked into the hospital room. His expression was unreadable, his posture stiff, as if he was bracing for something. The years of tension between them hung in the air like a cloud. Trump stood up from his bed, suddenly feeling small in the presence of his son. "Don," he said softly, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "Hi, Dad," Don Jr. replied, his eyes avoiding Trump's. He took a seat across from him, arms crossed defensively. Trump studied his son closely, searching for some sign of how this conversation would unfold. Don Jr. had always been his right-hand man, the one who seemed most willing to carry on the family business. But over the past few years, something had shifted between them. Trump had been so consumed with the politics of it all that he hadn't seen it coming. "I'm glad you came," Trump said, trying to sound calm. "I know we've had our differences, but I want to try, Don. I know I've hurt you, and I want to make it right." Don Jr. let out a sharp exhale, his eyes finally meeting Trump's. "Make it right?" he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You think you can just walk in here after everything that's happened and make it right?" Trump flinched at the anger in his son's voice, but he didn't pull back. He had to hear this. He had to listen. "I know I can't undo the past, Don," Trump said, his voice steadying, "but I can start by being honest with you. I wasn't there for you when you needed me the most. I was too focused on myself, on the empire, on winning. And in doing that, I pushed you away. I pushed everyone away." Don Jr.'s face hardened. "You think you pushed me away? You think it was just some mistake? Dad, you were too busy with your own ego to care about any of us. You made everything about you, and we were just supposed to follow along, like it was some game. But it wasn't a game, Dad. This was real life." Trump's throat tightened. The pain in Don Jr.'s words hit harder than any criticism he had faced. His son was right. It had always been about control, about winning. And somewhere along the way, he had forgotten the most important part of being a father, being there for his children, no matter what. "I'm sorry, Don," Trump whispered, his voice breaking. "I failed you. I failed as a father. I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I didn't see that I was suffocating you. I was too focused on building a legacy that I didn't realize I was tearing apart the family that should have meant the most to me." Don Jr.'s eyes flickered, a mixture of pain and resignation in his gaze. "I don't know, Dad. I don't know if I can just let it go. It's not just the business or the public stuff. It's the years of feeling like I wasn't enough. Like I was just a footnote in your shadow." Trump winced, the truth of Don Jr.'s words cutting through him. It had never been his intention to make his son feel small, but in his pursuit of success, that was exactly what he had done. "I never meant to make you feel that way," Trump said softly, his heart heavy. "I see now that I was wrong. You are more than enough. I should have told you that a long time ago." Don Jr. sat in silence, his arms uncrossed now, but his expression still wary. "I don't know if I can just forgive you, Dad," he said quietly, the pain evident in his voice. "I'm not sure I can forget all the times you chose everything else over us." Trump nodded slowly, his own eyes filling with tears. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I want to start over. We can take this one step at a time, if you're willing." For a long time, Don Jr. said nothing. Trump waited, his heart pounding in his chest, desperate for any sign that his son would even consider it. Finally, Don Jr. spoke, his voice rough but softer than before. "I don't know what that looks like, Dad. I don't know how we get back to where we were, or if we can, but I guess we can try, one step at a time." Trump felt a surge of relief, mixed with sadness. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a promise of forgiveness, but it was a start. And that, for now, was enough. Trump sat in the dimly lit hospital room, alone with his thoughts. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotional confrontations, and he found himself questioning everything he had built, everything he had done. His conversation with Don Jr. had been a bittersweet victory. The two of them had taken a tentative step toward reconciliation, but there was still so much unresolved. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that made his stomach tighten. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" Trump said, trying to mask the uncertainty in his voice. "Mr. Trump," came the voice on the other end. It was deep, steady, and unmistakable. "It's Michael. Michael Cohen." Trump's breath caught in his throat. The name brought a rush of memories, some bitter, some angry. Michael Cohen had been his lawyer, his confidant, until their falling out had shattered what little trust remained between them. Trump hadn't spoken to him in years, but now, here he was, calling him out of nowhere. "What do you want?" Trump asked, his voice colder than he intended. "I know we haven't spoken in a long time," Cohen said, his voice tinged with the weight of regret, "but I think it's time we talked." Trump sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Michael Cohen was not someone he expected to hear from again. Not after everything that had happened. Cohen had been a loyal ally for many years, but that loyalty had turned sour after the investigations, the public scrutiny, and the criminal charges. Trump had never truly forgiven Cohen for cooperating with authorities, even if it had been to save himself. But now, as the silence hung between them, Trump realized something. Perhaps he had been too quick to cut Cohen out of his life. Cohen had been one of the few people who knew him inside and out. His strengths, his weaknesses, his fears. Could their conversation actually help him understand himself better? Or would it only reopen old wounds? "You know, Michael," Trump said slowly, his voice less harsh now, "it's been a long time. Why now? Why after all this time are you reaching out?" Cohen let out a sigh. "Because I've been thinking a lot. About the things I did, about the things you did, about what's happened since we last spoke. And I think you deserve to hear something from me, something I should have said a long time ago." Trump's curiosity piqued, but he was still wary. "And what's that?" "I'm sorry," Cohen said, his voice low but sincere. "I'm sorry for what happened between us. I'm sorry for the role I played in all the chaos. But most of all, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner how far you were going down the wrong path. You were so focused on winning, so obsessed with power, that you lost sight of the people who mattered most. Your family, your integrity, your soul." Trump felt a knot form in his stomach. He had expected the call to be more about Cohen's own defense or some apology for what had happened. But this was different. Cohen was speaking to him not as a lawyer, not as an employee, but as someone who had watched the whole thing unfold with a sense of regret. "I never wanted to hurt you, Trump," Cohen continued, "but I see now that I played my part in enabling you. We both did. We all did. And that's why we're here, in this mess." Trump's fingers tightened around the phone as Cohen's words hit home. He'd always been the one in control, the one calling the shots, the one who could bend the rules to his advantage. He'd never been one to look inward, to question his actions, to consider how his behavior affected the people closest to him. But now, as he listened to Cohen, he couldn't help but see the reflection of the man he had become. All the bluster, all the bravado. It was a mask, a shield he had built to protect himself from the vulnerability he refused to face. But now, in the quiet of his hospital room, with his family slowly opening their hearts to him, Trump felt the weight of the truth crashing down on him. "You're right," Trump muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I lost my way. I focused on the wrong things, and I pushed everyone who cared about me away. I thought I could fix everything with power, with money, with control. But I see now that it wasn't about any of that. It was about connection. It was about love. And I don't know if I can fix it all." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Trump thought Cohen might hang up. But when Cohen spoke again, his voice was steady, almost comforting. "You can't fix everything, Donald," Cohen said, using Trump's first name as a reminder of the person he had once been. "But you can start. You can start with the things that matter. You can start with your family. You can start by being honest with yourself and with them. And maybe, just maybe, you can make amends." Trump sat in silence, processing Cohen's words. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and for the first time in years, he saw himself clearly. The man who had driven people away, the man who had been consumed by power, he didn't recognize that man anymore. "I'm trying, Michael," Trump said quietly. "I'm trying to fix things. But it's harder than I ever thought it would be." "I know it is," Cohen replied. "But nothing worth having comes easy." As the conversation ended, Trump was left with a sense of quiet resolve. Cohen's words had stung, but they had also opened something inside of him. It was clear that the road to redemption wouldn't be a straight line. It wouldn't be without pain, without confrontation, and without the ghosts of the past coming back to haunt him. But perhaps, for the first time, he was ready to face those ghosts, not as a man running from his mistakes, but as a man who wanted to make things right. Trump leaned back in his bed, his thoughts turning to the next step in his journey. He knew the healing process wasn't just about his children or his business. It was about him, too. He had to rebuild his own self-respect before he could rebuild the relationships that mattered most. He picked up his phone again, this time dialing a number he hadn't dialed in years, the number for his former assistant, Hope Hicks. She had been a trusted ally, someone who had stood by him through thick and thin. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to ask for her forgiveness, too. Trump hadn't expected it to be so hard. After the conversation with Michael Cohen, he felt like he was on the verge of something that could change the course of his life. But when he reached for his phone to call Hope Hicks, the familiar sensation of hesitation washed over him. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the decisions, but this was different. Hope wasn't just an employee. She had been his right-hand person, someone he had trusted when everyone else seemed to be against him. Yet, over time, even that bond had deteriorated. He thought about the last time he'd seen Hope, before everything had crumbled. She had been one of the few people who stood by him through thick and thin. But when the scandals hit and the walls started closing in, she had distanced herself. She had left, quietly and without fanfare. Trump had never fully understood why, but deep down, he knew that he had played a role in pushing her away. He had been reckless with his power, blind to how his actions affected the people closest to him. Trump took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. He scrolled through his contacts, found her name, and pressed the dial button. The phone rang twice before Hope picked up. "Hello?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. It had been years, after all. "Hope," Trump said, his voice carrying the weight of years of unsaid things. "It's Donald." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and Trump wondered if she was considering hanging up. But then, Hope spoke. "Mr. Trump," she said, and there was something in her tone that made Trump pause. It wasn't the dismissive coldness he had feared, but it wasn't warm either. It was guarded, as if she was bracing for whatever was coming next. "I didn't expect to hear from you." "I know," Trump replied. "I know it's been a long time. And I'm sorry. I wanted to talk." Hope didn't respond immediately, and Trump could almost hear the gears turning in her mind. He could feel the distance between them, and he wondered if it would ever shrink. "Okay," she said finally, after a pause. "Let's talk." Trump leaned back against the headboard of his hospital bed, his mind racing with the words he needed to say. Hope had been with him through many highs. She had helped him navigate some of the most difficult moments in his career. She had been a steady hand during the campaign and had stood by him even when things seemed impossible. Yet, somehow, he had taken her loyalty for granted. He had been consumed by his own world, too caught up in winning and maintaining power to see how far he had pushed her. "I've been thinking a lot about the past," Trump began, his voice softening. "About everything that happened, especially the people I hurt. And I know you're one of the people I hurt most. I took you for granted, Hope. I never realized how much you meant to me, how much you helped me. And I'm sorry for that." Hope didn't immediately respond. She had always been composed, even in the face of conflict. But Trump could hear the hesitation in her silence, the weight of years spent apart. "I didn't leave because of the pressure," Hope finally said, her voice quieter than it had been before. "I left because I couldn't be part of what was happening anymore. It wasn't just the scandals, the lies, or the chaos. It was that I couldn't reconcile who you were becoming with the person I once believed in. You lost sight of the things that mattered, Donald. And I couldn't stay in that environment anymore. Trump felt the sting of her words, but he didn't flinch. This wasn't about defending himself. It was about hearing the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I get it, Trump said, his voice steady. I lost my way. I was too focused on power and everything else to see what was slipping away from me. And I pushed you out, even when you were one of the only people who cared enough to stay. I was wrong. I shouldn't have let you go. Another silence settled over the conversation. Trump could feel hope weighing his words, and he knew this wasn't going to be easy. Trust was fragile, and years of hurt couldn't be undone with just a few sentences. I don't know if I can forgive you, Donald, Hope said, her voice tinged with sadness. Not yet, at least. What you did, what happened to all of us, it was beyond just a mistake. It felt like betrayal. But that's something I'm still working through. Trump swallowed hard. He had expected this. He had expected her to be cautious, to hold back. He didn't blame her. In fact, he admired her for her honesty. He knew this wasn't going to be a simple fix. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Trump said softly. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I want to make things right, Hope. Even if it takes time. I want to prove that I'm not the same person I was. Hope's voice was still guarded, but there was something softer in it now. You were never the same person, Donald. You were always changing, always striving for something more. But at some point, you lost the thread. You stopped caring about the people who mattered. And that's why we're here now. Trump paused, feeling the weight of her words sinking in. I'm ready to change, he said, his voice quieter. Not just for you, not just for the people I hurt, but for myself. I've been so focused on what I thought I needed to do, but now I realize I need to fix the things I broke. Starting with you. There was a long pause before Hope spoke again. I don't know if you can fix everything, Donald, but if you're really committed to changing, if you're really serious about rebuilding, then I'm willing to listen. I can't promise that everything will be the same, or that we'll pick up where we left off, but I'll give you the chance to prove it. Trump felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered with the realization that rebuilding trust would be an ongoing process. It wouldn't be fast or easy, and Hope had made it clear that she wouldn't tolerate any more mistakes. But for the first time in a long time, Trump felt like he was on the path toward something better. I'll prove it to you, Hope, Trump said, his voice firm with determination. I'll prove that I can be better. And I won't give up, not until I've earned your trust again. Hope sighed, a long, weary sound. We'll see. But for now, I'll take your word for it. One step at a time, right? Trump woke up early the next morning, his mind still heavy with the conversation he had had with Hope. He had expected it to be hard, but he hadn't expected to feel so raw. The weight of his past actions had never been clearer. He thought about everything he had lost, the trust of his friends, his family, his closest allies, and the cost it had taken on his own identity. For years, he had believed that power, control, and winning were everything. But now, after all the chaos and the isolation, he was beginning to understand something much more profound. As he sat up in bed, the sunlight streaming through the window, he realized that the journey ahead wasn't just about mending broken relationships. It was about rediscovering who he was beneath all the layers of persona, power, and pride. It was about looking inward, something he had never truly done before. He picked up his phone, his finger hovering over the screen. Hope had agreed to give him a chance to prove himself, but it was just the first step. He still had a long way to go with everyone in his life. He thought about Don Jr., who had been more open to their reconciliation, but even that felt fragile. The last thing Trump wanted was to make another mistake. But that was the risk of change. He couldn't predict the outcome. A message pinged on his phone. It was from Don Jr. Dad, let's talk. You around today? Trump smiled faintly. It had only been a few days since their breakthrough conversation, but the path ahead was still uncertain. Don Jr. had been one of the hardest to reach, but now that their relationship was on the mend, Trump knew that his son would be a critical part of his journey. If he could prove himself to Don Jr., maybe the rest of the world, his former associates, his friends, and even his family, could follow suit. He quickly typed a reply. Absolutely. Let's meet. I'll have my people set it up. The conversation with Don Jr. later that day was tense, but not in the way Trump expected. Don Jr. had softened since their last encounter, but there was still a wariness in his eyes, an unspoken question that lingered between them. Could Trump truly change, or was this just another round of empty promises? They met in a small, private room in the hospital, away from the reporters and the chaos outside. Don Jr. sat across from his father, arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. Trump could sense the discomfort in his son's posture, the way he avoided meeting his gaze. But at least he was here. "How are you, Dad?" Don Jr. asked, his voice steady but not warm. "I'm doing better," Trump replied, trying to sound confident. "I'm really working on everything. On myself. I know it's been a mess, and I know I've let you down." Don Jr. raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You don't say," he said, his tone light, but there was an edge of sarcasm in it. "I know you've been working on yourself for a while, Dad, but this time, what's different? What's changed?" Trump leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his eyes locking with Don Jr.'s. "I've had a lot of time to think, son. A lot of time to realize that winning isn't everything. I can't undo the mistakes I've made, but I can start by being honest with myself and with you." Don Jr. stared at him, his jaw clenched. Trump could see the conflict in his son's eyes, the desire to believe, but the scars of the past still too fresh to allow for easy forgiveness. "You say that now," Don Jr. said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes never leaving his father's. "But how do I know it's real? How do I know this isn't just another round of 'I'm sorry' without anything to show for it?" Trump felt a pang in his chest. He understood Don Jr.'s skepticism. It was exactly how he had felt when Hope had expressed her doubts. But this time, he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to offer empty promises. "I'm not asking for forgiveness right away," Trump said, his voice firm. "I know it's going to take time, but I want to show you that I'm not the same person. I want to prove it, even if it takes years. You deserve that, and so does everyone else." Don Jr. studied his father for a long moment. Finally, he nodded, though the expression on his face remained guarded. "All right, Dad. I'll give you the time to prove it, but don't expect it to be easy." Later that evening, after Don Jr. left, Trump sat alone in his room, deep in thought. His son's words echoed in his mind, "Don't expect it to be easy." It was a stark reminder that redemption wasn't something that could be bought or earned overnight. It wasn't a matter of regaining power or control. It was about showing consistency, vulnerability, and sincerity. But honesty, especially with himself, was proving to be harder than he anticipated. Every day, he faced triggers from his past, the news cycles, the constant reminders of his presidency, the whisper of scandal that still followed him. The temptation to slip back into old habits, to retreat into the world he knew best, was always there. But Trump was determined to push through. He thought back to his conversation with Hope. The idea of changing for the better, of starting anew, was appealing. But it required him to let go of everything he had once believed in, everything that had defined him for so long. As he reflected, a wave of uncertainty swept over him. Could he truly change? Could he really rebuild what he had destroyed? The road ahead was long, and the stakes had never been higher. But one thing was clear: Trump couldn't do it alone. He needed his family. He needed his son. And he needed to find a way to reconcile with the world he had so carelessly fractured. Just as Trump's thoughts began to spiral, a call came through on his phone. It was from someone he hadn't expected to hear from, Ivanka. "Hi, Dad," Ivanka's voice came through, warm yet tentative. "How are you feeling?" Trump smiled faintly, relieved by the sound of her voice. Ivanka had always been one of the few who had stood by him without question. But like everyone else, she had her limits. He knew she had been hurt by his actions, and the walls between them were still high. "I'm doing all right," he said, trying to sound more upbeat than he felt. "How about you?" "I've been thinking a lot," Ivanka replied, "about everything that happened. I know I've been distant, and She paused, then continued. "I just want you to know that I'm open to hearing you out, Dad. I'm not sure where we go from here, but I'm willing to try." Trump's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Ivanka's willingness to listen, to offer him a chance, was a step in the right direction. But he knew he couldn't take her support for granted. He had to prove himself not just to her, but to all of them. "Thank you, Ivanka," Trump said softly. "I don't expect everything to be fixed overnight, but I'll do whatever it takes." The media storm had never really subsided, even after Trump's departure from the White House. Every move he made, every word he spoke, was still dissected by pundits, commentators, and critics. But now, as Trump began his journey toward redemption, the pressure was even more intense. The world wasn't just watching him as a politician. They were watching him as a man trying to repair a shattered reputation, a man they had once cheered on, but who had fallen from grace in the most spectacular way possible. It was a beautiful spring afternoon when the first signs of this new kind of pressure started to become evident. Trump had been meeting with his legal team in a small room in the hospital, going over strategies for handling the ongoing investigations into his finances and actions during his presidency. The legal battles were never-ending, and every new report was another reminder of the chaos he had left behind. But today, he had other things on his mind. His phone buzzed, and Trump glanced at it, expecting another notification from his team. Instead, it was a news alert from one of the major networks. Trump's family tensions, a new hope for redemption, or just another political play? Trump's heart sank. The headlines weren't what he had hoped for. The media, ever eager to dissect his every move, were already questioning his motivations. The story was about his recent efforts to reconnect with his children, particularly his sons, Don Jr. and Eric, but it was framed with skepticism. Journalists were quick to label his actions as politically motivated, as if every personal gesture had an ulterior motive. There was little to no room for understanding or compassion. For the media, Trump was still the man who had orchestrated one of the most divisive presidencies in recent history. He set the phone down with a sigh. As much as he hated to admit it, the criticism stung. He had made a real effort to rebuild his relationship with Don Jr., but it seemed like that wouldn't be enough to quell the doubters. His attempts at redemption felt like a performance to many, as if no one believed he was sincere. Trump wasn't used to this kind of skepticism. He had always been the one who controlled the narrative, who dictated how he was perceived. But now, every word he spoke was met with mistrust, every attempt to repair his image seen as another political play. The door to the small meeting room opened, and Don Jr. entered, his face etched with the same weariness that Trump had seen before. Don Jr. had been open to their conversations, but now there was a tension between them that wasn't there before. Trump could sense it. Something had shifted in their dynamic. "How's everything going?" Trump asked, trying to sound upbeat, but it came out more forced than he intended. "Same old," Don Jr. replied, his tone flat. "But I saw the news. It's not exactly flattering, is it?" Trump frowned. "I saw it too. They're turning everything into a headline. They don't see what I'm trying to do here, son. They don't understand that this isn't about politics. This is about me, trying to fix what I broke." "I know," Don Jr. said, taking a seat across from him. "But that's the problem. The public doesn't want to believe that you've changed. They've already made up their minds. And the media? They love a scandal. They thrive on it. If you're not creating chaos, they'll create it for you." Trump leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the armrest. Don Jr. wasn't wrong. The public had a long memory, and the media was unforgiving. No matter how much he tried to prove himself, it seemed that every step forward was met with a pushback. "You think they'll ever see it? See that I'm really trying?" Trump asked, his voice quieter than usual. Don Jr. paused before answering. "I think they'll see it when they see it, Dad. But you can't control that. You have to just keep doing what you're doing. Be real. Forget the media. Focus on the people who matter. That's all you can do." Trump nodded slowly. It was a message he had heard before, but it had never felt more important than it did now. He couldn't let the public's perception define his journey. He had to focus on the people who mattered most, his family. If he could prove himself to them, maybe the rest would follow. That afternoon, Trump's publicist called to tell him about an upcoming interview he had been scheduled for. It was with a major network, a chance to speak directly to the public about his plans for redemption. At first, Trump had been hesitant. He wasn't sure if he was ready to put himself back in the public eye, especially when there were still so many who doubted his sincerity. But after talking with Don Jr., he realized this was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. It wasn't about convincing the media. It was about speaking to the people who had supported him in the past, the ones who still believed in him. As he prepared for the interview, Trump took a moment to reflect on the man he was now. This wasn't the same person who had stood in front of crowds and promised to make America great again. That man was gone. The man who sat before the cameras now was someone who had spent months, even years, reflecting on his actions and the consequences they had on the people around him. He was someone who had made mistakes, but who was also committed to changing. When the cameras started rolling, Trump looked directly into the lens and began to speak. I know that many of you are skeptical, and I understand why. I've made mistakes, and I've hurt a lot of people along the way. But I want you to know this. I'm working to be a better man. Not for the media, not for the politicians, but for the people who matter most to me, my family, my friends, and the American people who trusted me. Trump paused, looking down for a moment, collecting his thoughts. I've spent my life chasing power, but now I'm chasing something else. I'm chasing redemption. I know it's not going to be easy, and I know I've got a lot of work to do, but I'm asking for the chance to show you that I'm more than the mistakes I've made. The interview aired later that evening, and the response was mixed. Some of his supporters were cautiously optimistic, applauding his willingness to admit his past wrongs. But others were less convinced, seeing it as a calculated move to reclaim his political relevance. The media was quick to criticize his statements, questioning whether his words were sincere or just another attempt to rebuild his image. Trump had expected this. He knew the road to redemption was never going to be easy. The people who had followed him would either believe in his transformation or they wouldn't. But he also knew that he couldn't let the noise of the world stop him from continuing his journey. Trump's appearance in the media has sparked a wave of reactions, from skepticism to support. But in the end, it's the personal relationships he's mending, especially with his family, that will determine if his transformation is real. Do you think someone can truly change, or are people forever defined by their past actions? What does it take for someone to prove they've changed? Can public perception ever be fully trusted? Trump sat alone in his office, the sunlight casting long shadows across the room. It had been weeks since his last public interview, and despite his efforts to rebuild his relationships and repair his reputation, it seemed like the more he tried, the harder the world pushed back. The media continued to churn out stories, many of which questioned the authenticity of his change. He was criticized for every misstep, no matter how small, and praised for every minor success, but only with suspicion. Public perception had always been a double-edged sword, but now it felt like the blade was cutting deeper. His phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. It was a message from Hope. I saw the interview. You did well, but be careful. The media is always going to twist things. Stay focused on the real work, rebuilding your relationships, not your image. Trump stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the weight of her words. He had known the media would never let him off easy. They would always see him as a headline, a spectacle, something to be dissected. But Hope was right. He couldn't get lost in the noise. He had to focus on what really mattered. The thought of Hope brought a small, familiar sense of comfort. Despite the ups and downs, she had been one of the few people to stand by him. But as his phone buzzed again, the comfort quickly turned to dread. It was Don Jr. We need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow? Trump's heart skipped a beat. Their last conversation had been one of the few real moments of connection between them. But now, something in Don Jr.'s message told him that things were not as simple as they seemed. The next morning, Trump met Don Jr. at one of his favorite private spots, a secluded cafe just outside the city. It was a place where they could talk away from the cameras, away from the distractions of the world. As Trump entered, he saw his son sitting at a corner table, his back straight, his expression unreadable. Don Jr. looked up as his father approached, but his gaze wasn't warm. There was a coolness in his eyes, something Trump hadn't seen in him before. "Hey, Dad," Don Jr. said, offering a small nod. Trump sat down across from him, his stomach tightening. "What's going on, son?" Don Jr. took a deep breath before speaking, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking a lot. About everything. You know, about us. and about what you're doing. The media, the interviews, the apologies. I'm just not sure it's enough. Trump's heart sank. What do you mean? I've been doing the work. I'm trying to show you that I've changed. It's not about that, Don Jr. replied, his eyes narrowing. It's about the fact that you've been doing this for the cameras, not for yourself. People are watching. The media's eating it up. But I'm not sure you've really internalized what all of this means. You keep talking about change, but I don't see you making the sacrifices that would prove you've really turned the corner. Trump felt a surge of frustration. This wasn't the support he had hoped for from his son. It felt like an accusation, one that struck at the core of his very efforts. I'm not doing this for the cameras, Don, Trump said, his voice rising. I'm doing it because I've lost people. I've lost you. I've lost hope. I've lost my own identity. This isn't just about public image. It's about trying to fix the damage I've done. Don Jr. shook his head, his jaw clenched. You say that, but you haven't really shown it. I need more than words. I need to see you making real changes. Actions speak louder than all the apologies in the world. Trump sat back, the sting of his son's words cutting deeper than any criticism he had faced from the media. For years, he had been able to control the narrative. But now, it was his family, the people he loved most, who were questioning his sincerity. Later that day, Trump returned to his room in the hospital, his mind swirling with everything that had been said. He had always prided himself on his ability to bounce back from adversity, but this was different. The fight he was in now wasn't just about politics or public opinion. It was about his family, his legacy, and his very identity. As he sat on the edge of the bed, he felt the weight of it all. His failed relationships, his mistakes, the shattered trust that had been built over years. Don Jr. was right. Words alone wouldn't be enough. He couldn't just apologize and expect everything to fall into place. If he wanted to prove that he had changed, he had to make real sacrifices. He had to put his family first, even if that meant stepping away from the spotlight. The thought of it left him feeling uncertain, vulnerable. For so long, he had been defined by his power, his wealth, and his ability to command attention. But now, as he stared at his reflection in the mirror, he realized that none of that mattered anymore. The person staring back at him wasn't the man he had been. He was someone else, a man who had made mistakes, a man who was trying to repair his life, piece by piece. Trump closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be neat or tidy, but he couldn't give up. He couldn't let his past define him forever. There was still time to change, to prove to Don Jr., to Hope, to everyone who had ever cared about him, that he could be a better man. That night, Trump called Hope. It was a call he wasn't sure he was ready for, but it was one he needed to make. Hope, he began, his voice soft but steady. I had a tough conversation with Don Jr. today. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I don't think he sees it that way. Hope was quiet for a moment, then responded, her voice calm. What did he say? He wants to see more than just words, Trump replied, feeling the weight of his son's skepticism. He needs to see real change. And I think he's right. I've been focused on the wrong things, on the media, on public perception, and not enough on the real work that needs to be done. Hope's voice softened. It's not easy, Donald. Real change never is. But you've started on the right path. Just don't lose sight of why you're doing this. Don't let the noise distract you from what really matters. Trump nodded, though he knew she couldn't see it. Thanks, Hope. I needed to hear that. Trump had never been good at waiting. For most of his life, action had been his constant companion. Whether it was building empires, making deals, or simply being in the public eye, he was always on the move. But now, as he sat in his private office late at night, the silence weighed on him. The world had been watching his every move, scrutinizing his attempts at redemption, but he still felt like he was failing, especially when it came to his family. Don Jr.'s words still haunted him. I need to see real change, Dad. The thought had been lingering in his mind for days. The frustration was overwhelming, but at the same time, it was a challenge he couldn't ignore. If he truly wanted to rebuild the trust he had lost, he would have to show, not tell. Trump leaned back in his chair and stared out of the window. His mind was racing. What did Don Jr. need to see? What could he do to prove he wasn't just playing a game for public sympathy? He had already apologized, tried to reconnect, but nothing seemed enough. It was like the ghosts of his past kept rising up, and no matter what he did, they wouldn't leave him alone. It was time for a new approach. Trump had always believed in the power of action over words, but now he understood that it wasn't just about making grand gestures. It was about showing up, being present, being consistent. But he didn't know where to start. The following evening, Trump invited his children, Don Jr., Eric, and Ivanka, to a family dinner at one of his private estates. It was a simple gesture, one he had done many times before, but this time, it was different. He wasn't doing it for the cameras or to impress anyone. He was doing it because, for the first time, he felt like he truly needed them. As the family gathered around the dinner table, the usual tension was palpable. It wasn't like the old days when they could sit together and talk about business or share stories from the campaign trail. Tonight, the conversation felt forced, awkward even. Ivanka was the first to break the silence, her voice calm and measured as always. "Dad, I know this has been hard," she said, looking directly at him. "We all know that. But I think what we're all looking for is consistency. It's one thing to say you've changed, but it's another to actually show it. We need to see the commitment to make it stick." Trump nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Ivanka had always been the thoughtful one, the one who could see things clearly when everyone else was caught up in the chaos. But hearing her say it, hearing her express what Don Jr. had said earlier, hurt more than he expected. It was like they were all waiting for him to prove something he wasn't sure he could. "I understand," he replied, his voice sincere but tinged with frustration. "I know I've made mistakes, and I know I've let you all down in ways I can't undo. But I'm working on it. I'm here, right now, trying to be better. For you, for the family." Eric, who had been silent up until that point, looked at his father with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "But it's not just about being here physically, Dad. It's about making real sacrifices. I mean, look at everything you've been involved in, whether it's the media or the businesses. You've built your life on winning, on power. What are you willing to let go of to prove that you've changed?" The question hit Trump hard. Eric wasn't wrong. He had spent his whole life chasing after power, and now, that same power seemed like the very thing that was keeping him from rebuilding what mattered most. The next day, as Trump walked through the hospital halls, he found himself caught in a whirlwind of thoughts. He needed to make a choice. The road ahead would be paved with sacrifices he wasn't sure he was ready to make. For so long, his identity had been tied to success, to power, to being the man who could always command attention. But now, as he faced the possibility of losing everything, his family, his legacy, his reputation, he realized that the price of redemption wasn't going to be cheap. It was at that moment that a thought struck him. What if I step away from everything? Not forever, but just long enough to prove that he was serious about his change. Maybe it was time to take a break from the public spotlight, to give his family and himself the space to heal. Maybe he needed to show them, not through grand gestures or public apologies, but through quiet action and consistency, that he was capable of putting them first. Trump called a private meeting with his closest advisors. They were sitting in the hospital's conference room, and the atmosphere was tense. The news cycle had been dominated by his family dinner and the lingering doubts about his sincerity. Every move Trump made was being watched, and the pressure was mounting. But he was determined to make a choice that would reflect his commitment to his family, not his political ambitions. "I've made up my mind," Trump said, looking at his advisors. "I'm going to step back. I'm going to take a break from the media. I'm going to focus on my family. No more interviews, no more public appearances for a while." The room fell silent as his advisors exchanged uncertain glances. "Sir, are you sure?" one of them asked. "Your name is everything right now. Stepping away could make people think you're giving up, that you're weak." Trump shook his head. "It's not about weakness. It's about strength. I've spent so many years chasing power and fame, but now I realize I need to prove something else. I need to prove that I can be more than the man I was. I need to show my family that I can put them first." As Trump withdrew from the public eye, he found himself facing an internal battle that was harder than any political campaign. For the first time in years, He was forced to confront the truth of who he had been and what he had become. Without the constant noise of the media or the pressure of being in the public eye, he found that the silence was deafening. He spent more time with his children, listening to their concerns, their hopes, and their doubts. He began to understand that trust couldn't be rebuilt with words alone. It had to be earned through patience, consistency, and sacrifice. But even as he worked to rebuild his relationships, the external pressure was never far away. The media was still watching, still waiting for the next headline. But for the first time, Trump wasn't playing for them. He was playing for his family and for himself. Trump's withdrawal from the public marked a turning point. For the first time in his life, he was fully committed to being present with his family, working through the difficulties that had plagued them for so long. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But he knew one thing. If he wanted redemption, it would have to come from within. The road ahead was long, and the challenges were far from over. But Trump had finally realized that redemption wasn't about winning the next battle. It was about facing the truth, making the necessary changes, and earning the trust of those he had hurt the most. The first few weeks of Trump's self-imposed media hiatus were quieter than he had anticipated. At first, he enjoyed the peace. His mornings were no longer interrupted by phone calls from journalists, his evenings didn't end with TV interviews, and the constant barrage of questions about his past decisions had quieted. He spent more time with his children, especially Don Jr., who had remained distant despite the attempts to rebuild their relationship. But as the days passed, the weight of his isolation started to sink in. There was an unfamiliar silence that stretched through his mornings and evenings, an emptiness that was hard to ignore. Without the constant noise of the media or the adrenaline of public appearances, Trump had more time to reflect on the choices he had made in the past and the man he had become. It was in these quiet moments that the real struggle began. He found himself in long, silent conversations with his family, trying to rebuild trust and repair the fractures in their relationships. Don Jr. remained guarded, and though Ivanka's calm demeanor was a comforting presence, there was a tension in the air. It was as though everyone was watching to see if Trump would slip back into his old patterns. And every time he hesitated, every time his commitment to change faltered, it felt like they were ready to abandon him again. One afternoon, Trump sat in the large living room of his private estate, a notebook open in front of him. His mind was racing, but he couldn't concentrate on anything. Don Jr. entered the room and sat down across from him, a look of determination on his face. "Dad, we need to talk," Don Jr. said, his voice firm. Trump put down his pen and turned to face him. "What's on your mind?" Don Jr. didn't mince words. "You've been taking this quiet time seriously, and I respect that. But I need to know, once and for all, if you're really in this. I don't need more speeches or promises. I need to see actions. No more going back to what you were. No more distractions. I'm not asking for perfection, but I need to see that you're committed. And I need you to do that by showing up, not just for us, but for yourself." Trump could feel the weight of his son's words. It wasn't just about proving his sincerity to the world anymore. It was about proving it to the one person who had been closest to him for years, his own son. And that realization cut deeper than any public criticism ever could. "I've been showing up, Don," Trump replied, his voice low. "I'm here. I've cut out the media. I've been working on things with you, with Ivanka, with Eric. But I know I have to do more. I understand that. I'm trying to figure out what comes next." Don Jr. leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Trump. "What comes next is simple. You make a decision. You decide if you're willing to keep fighting for the change you say you want, or if this was just another phase. If you want to rebuild your relationship with us, with everyone, you need to prove you're willing to sacrifice your ego." Trump didn't respond immediately. The words hung in the air. He had always been the man who needed to win, who needed to be at the center of attention. But now, with Don Jr. staring at him, he realized that winning in the past hadn't been enough. The public victories, the accolades, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was the quiet moments, the real ones, and those had to be earned. In an attempt to create space for healing, Trump organized a weekend getaway with his family. The idea was simple: no business, no media, just a chance to reconnect. They would spend time outdoors, away from the distractions of their everyday lives, to focus on what truly mattered: family. As they arrived at the cabin in the mountains, the atmosphere was different. For the first time in a long time, the Trump family felt like they were coming together for the right reasons. Don Jr., Eric, and Ivanka were still wary, but there was a slight shift. They didn't expect Trump to be perfect, but they were cautiously hopeful that this was the beginning of something real. That evening, they sat around a campfire, the flames crackling in the cool air. Trump found himself looking at his children in a way he hadn't for years. There was a deep love there, a sense of pride and regret intertwined. He knew he had hurt them, but he also knew that this was his chance to make things right. "I'm sorry," Trump said, his voice quieter than usual. "For everything. For not being there when you needed me. For putting my ego ahead of our family. I've done a lot of things in my life that I'm not proud of. But I'm here now, and I'm trying to do better." Ivanka, who had been quiet all evening, looked at him with a gentle expression. "It's not just about saying sorry, Dad. It's about showing us that you're willing to make changes. To be here. To stay here. We don't need perfection. We need to know that you're willing to fight for this family. For us." Eric, ever the skeptic, nodded slowly. "We're not expecting you to change overnight. But if you want us to trust you again, you have to keep showing up, consistently. No more back and forth." Trump felt a lump form in his throat. The sincerity in their voices was overwhelming. They weren't asking for him to become someone else. They were asking for the man he had been, just without the arrogance, the need for validation, and the endless pursuit of attention. They wanted a father who was present, a leader who was humble. After the weekend, Trump continued his quiet work on rebuilding his relationships. He spent more time with his children, focused less on the public and more on his personal growth. But despite his efforts, the toll of his decision to step away from the public spotlight was starting to become clear. The world had moved on. New stories were being written, new scandals were emerging, and the media was slowly forgetting about him. But Trump wasn't looking for the spotlight anymore. What he had found in the stillness was something far more valuable: connection. He had always been in the public eye, surrounded by people who admired him or feared him. But now, with his family, he was starting to rebuild the most important relationships in his life. The ones that had been broken by years of neglect. The quiet, the solitude. It was hard at times, but it was also necessary. He had to prove to himself, first and foremost, that he could change, that he could evolve beyond the man he had been. And maybe, just maybe, he could do it without needing the approval of the world. It had been a few months since Trump withdrew from the public eye, focusing solely on his family and his personal growth. The quiet had given him space to reflect, to mend his relationship with Don Jr., Ivanka, and Eric. But the world outside hadn't stopped moving. The media, once obsessed with every word he uttered, now seemed to have found new distractions. Stories about his absence filled the airwaves, but they weren't the kinds of headlines he used to dominate. The world had moved on, perhaps too quickly for Trump's comfort. Yet, as much as he tried to ignore the public's shifting gaze, he could feel the pressure mounting. There were murmurs within his business empire about his sudden retreat. Even his closest allies were starting to ask questions. "Sir, we need to talk," one of his top advisors, Mark, said as he entered Trump's private study one late morning. Trump had been poring over paperwork, his mind elsewhere, trying to keep the weight of his decisions at bay. "What is it, Mark?" Trump asked, not bothering to look up. "It's about your businesses. People are starting to notice the shift. Investors, partners, they're questioning your commitment. Your silence is starting to speak louder than anything you've said before." Trump's shoulders tensed. He had known this moment was coming. His absence from the public eye might have been a personal decision, but the ripples were being felt everywhere. His empire, built on the constant need for attention and control, was now facing the consequences of his withdrawal. "I'm doing what I need to do," Trump muttered, trying to maintain his composure. Mark hesitated. "With all due respect, sir, this isn't just about your family anymore. You're starting to lose everything you've worked for. If you don't come back, if you don't reassert your dominance, it could all crumble." Trump's mind raced. The words Mark had spoken weren't new to him. For years, His success had been tied to his public persona, the larger-than-life figure who thrived in the spotlight. But now, as he sat in the solitude of his study, he couldn't help but wonder, was it too late to change? As the days went on, Trump wrestled with a growing internal conflict. He had spent so long trying to rebuild his relationships, trying to show his family that he was committed to a new way of life. But every time he heard whispers about his faltering business, about people questioning his decisions, the pull to return to the spotlight grew stronger. The media was still there, waiting for him to speak out. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from old friends, political allies, and business partners, all asking for his help, his presence, his influence. One evening, as Trump sat alone at the kitchen table in his estate, he couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that perhaps he was running out of time. The media had moved on, yes, but what if they would forget him entirely if he stayed silent for too long? What if his family, his businesses, and his legacy all withered away in the absence of the Trump name? The tension between who he had been and who he was becoming was reaching a boiling point. He had made significant progress with his children. Don Jr. had even started to open up more, their relationship slowly mending. But his role in the world, his public identity, was still a gaping hole in his life. As if on cue, an old friend arrived, one who knew Trump from his heyday. Roger Stone, a longtime ally and strategist, appeared at Trump's door one afternoon, his characteristic grin plastered on his face. "I hear the Trump empire's gone quiet," Roger said, stepping inside with the familiar air of someone who had never been far away, even if physically absent. Trump didn't respond immediately, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Roger had always been a man who thrived in chaos. He was the kind of person who understood the power of a headline, the significance of a public image. "What do you want, Roger?" Trump asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Roger smiled knowingly. "I want to see you back in the game, Don. I want to see that fire in your eyes again. You've built an empire, a legacy. Don't throw it all away for a quiet life. The world needs Trump. Hell, the world misses Trump." Trump felt a stirring in his chest. He had been so focused on his family and his need for personal growth, but the idea of returning to the public sphere, of being the Trump that everyone knew and loved to hate, was a temptation he couldn't deny. "You've been quiet for a reason, haven't you?" Roger continued. "But silence isn't going to bring you the redemption you want. People have forgotten about you. They're moving on. If you want to keep your name alive, you need to step back into the spotlight." Trump looked out the window, the weight of Roger's words sinking in. Everything he had worked for, the businesses, the fame, the power, was slipping away. Could he really give it all up? Could he remain content in this quieter, simpler life? That night, as Trump lay awake in his bed, his mind churned with doubt. He had made progress. He had shown up for his family in ways he never had before. But could he truly give up his identity as the larger-than-life figure, the man who always commanded attention? The world had changed since he stepped back. The political landscape had shifted, new figures had emerged, and old allies had moved on. Was it too late for Trump to reclaim his position in the world? Was it even possible for him to be both the man his family needed and the public figure the world had once adored? Trump sat up, staring at the ceiling. The decision before him was clearer than ever. He could either continue down this path of personal growth with all its uncertainty and pain, or he could return to the spotlight and reclaim what he had lost. The former offered a chance at peace, at reconciliation, but it also meant facing the reality of being forgotten. The latter offered power, but at what cost? Was he willing to risk everything, even his newfound relationships, for the sake of ego and influence? As dawn broke over his estate, Trump finally made a choice. He would not return to the public eye, at least not yet. His family, his children, and his own peace of mind meant more to him now than the constant need for attention. He had already begun to rebuild what mattered most. But the temptation, the pull of his past, would never fully go away. Trump had made his decision. He would stay out of the media's glare, focusing instead on his family, his businesses, and his personal growth. It was a quieter life, one that didn't come with the bombastic headlines or the constant adrenaline rush of the spotlight. But as the weeks turned into months, the consequences of his choice began to reveal themselves. The first cracks appeared in his business empire. His absence was being felt more than he anticipated. Longtime partners, once loyal to the Trump brand, began to question his commitment to the future of his ventures. Investors, who had once flocked to him for his public presence and influence, grew uncertain. One evening, as Trump reviewed a report from one of his real estate firms, he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The company's stock had taken a dip. The luxury properties that had once been guaranteed successes were now facing uncertainty. Trump's name had always been a mark of luxury and success, but without his larger-than-life presence, the brand was starting to lose its luster. "Sir, we need to talk about your properties in Manhattan," said Richard, his chief financial officer, as he walked into Trump's office. "The market's been softening. Some of our investors are concerned. We haven't seen you at the meetings. The press isn't covering us the way it used to." Trump's mind raced. He had been so focused on his personal life, on rebuilding his relationship with his children and keeping the public out of his business. But he couldn't ignore the reality in front of him. His brand, his empire, was built on attention. Without it, the foundation was beginning to crack. "I'm not going back to the media circus, Richard," Trump replied, his voice resolute. "But I can't just watch everything fall apart either. We'll figure this out." Richard nodded, but there was concern in his eyes. "People are beginning to wonder if you're still invested in the Trump legacy, sir. If they don't see you leading, if they don't hear from you, they'll move on. You've got to make a decision." Trump's stomach churned. He had hoped that his withdrawal would bring peace. But instead, it seemed to have created a vacuum, one that was quickly being filled by uncertainty and doubt. As if the pressure from his business empire wasn't enough, Trump also felt the tension between him and Ivanka start to rise. While they had made strides in reconnecting, Ivanka had begun to express her own concerns about his growing detachment from the public and his brand. "I get that you want to change, Dad," Ivanka said one evening over dinner. "But you're not just leaving the public eye behind. You're leaving behind everything that made you who you are. This isn't just about you and us. It's about everything you've built, your name, your legacy." Trump looked at his daughter, a woman he'd always admired for her sharp mind and resilience. There was a time when her ambition mirrored his own. But now, as she sat across from him, there was a tension in her eyes. She didn't understand what he was trying to do. To her, his absence wasn't just a personal choice. It was a loss to the family business and the Trump brand. "I'm not abandoning everything, Ivanka," Trump said, his voice firm but tinged with frustration. "I'm focusing on what matters. It's about more than just buildings and deals. It's about us. It's about being present, being real." But Ivanka wasn't convinced. "I've seen what you've built, Dad. You can't just walk away from it all. If you don't show up, if you don't lead, everything will collapse. We've all worked so hard to get here. And now you're telling me it's all worth nothing?" Trump's heart sank. Ivanka's words cut deeper than he expected. He wasn't just losing his public identity. He was losing his connection with the very people who had helped build his empire. The weight of his decision to step back from the spotlight was starting to feel like an impossible burden. Despite his best efforts to stay out of the media, Trump couldn't escape the allure of the spotlight for long. As his business empire began to show signs of strain, the press returned to their old habits. They began to speculate about his future, about whether his withdrawal from the public was a sign of decline, or if there was something more behind it. One morning, as Trump was finishing his breakfast, his phone buzzed with a breaking news alert. It was a story from a major network, questioning whether Trump had become irrelevant, whether his silence had caused irreparable damage to his brand. The headline read, "Trump's Quiet Life. Is the Empire Crumbling?" The report went on to discuss his absence from key events, his lack of public statements, and the increasing concerns among investors. It wasn't just a headline. It was an attack on his legacy, an attempt to rewrite the story of who he was and what he had built. Trump's pulse quickened. He hadn't wanted this. He had worked so hard to avoid the media, to focus on his family, and yet here it was, his name in the headlines once again. Only this time it wasn't the praise he had come to expect. It was a question, a challenge to everything he had worked for. Later that day, Trump sat in his office, staring at the screen, watching as the news coverage continued to unfold. His phone rang again. It was Roger Stone. Trump hesitated before answering. "You've seen the news?" Roger asked, his voice full of energy. "I saw it," Trump replied, his tone terse. "What do you want, Roger?" "Listen, Don, this is exactly what I've been warning you about," Roger said. "Never one to mince words. The media is coming for you, and they're not going to stop. The longer you stay silent, the more they'll build the narrative. You need to make a decision now." Trump closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing thoughts. "I've already made my decision, Roger. I'm not going back to that life." Roger paused, but then he pressed on. "And what about everything you've worked for? The brand, the family, the legacy? What do you think will happen if you keep hiding away?" Trump's grip tightened around the phone. He wasn't sure anymore. Could he truly continue living a quiet life, detached from everything he had once known? Or would he have to return to the world that had defined him for so long? He didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing for sure. The price of silence was steeper than he had anticipated. As Trump sat alone in his office, the weight of his choices came crashing down on him. His family, his businesses, his legacy, all of it was at stake. And as much as he wanted to remain out of the public eye, he couldn't deny the pull of everything he had worked for. He looked out the window, deep in thought. The quiet life he had envisioned seemed like a distant dream now. The world didn't work the way he had hoped, and perhaps in the end, he couldn't walk away from it all. The media, the brand, the empire. His name had been built on attention, on dominance. Could he truly give that up? In the end, Trump realized that no matter how hard he tried, the world he had created would always be calling him back. It had been weeks since the media's coverage began to intensify, and Trump was feeling the heat from all sides. The quiet life he had envisioned was starting to unravel, piece by piece. Ivanka, Don Jr., and even Eric had started to press him harder. They wanted him to re-engage with the business, to come back to the media, to reignite the Trump brand. One evening, as Trump sat down for dinner with his children, the conversation took a serious turn. "Dad," Ivanka said, her voice filled with concern, "this silence, it's not working. You can't just step away from everything. Our company is being questioned. Investors are pulling out, and the brand is losing its strength. You know it's true. We need you, your leadership, your vision." Trump looked at Ivanka, his heart sinking. He had wanted this moment, the time to focus on them, to heal the relationships he had neglected. But now, it seemed like everything he had tried to build was slipping away from him. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. "I've been trying to do something different. Something for me. Something for us. But it seems like the world doesn't care about that." Don Jr. chimed in. "Dad, it's not about what they want. It's about the legacy you've built. You can't just walk away. You're stronger than this. We need you to fight for everything we've worked for." Trump felt a pang of guilt. His children weren't wrong. But as much as he wanted to rise to the occasion, a part of him longed for peace, the kind of peace that could only come from walking away from the chaos. Still, deep down, he knew the empire he had built could not survive without his leadership. As the days passed, the media coverage only worsened. News outlets ran story after story questioning Trump's relevance, his future, and whether he was even capable of leading the empire he had built. His public image was at stake. One morning, a headline flashed across his phone: "Trump's silence. Is he finally finished?" The article dissected his every move, or lack thereof, and speculated on the long-term impact of his absence. Trump could feel the walls closing in on him. His name, once synonymous with power and influence, was now being treated as a relic of the past. Roger Stone, always ready with advice, reached out again. "You see what's happening, Don? You're letting them define you." Roger's voice crackled over the phone. "You've got one choice left. You can either let them bury you, or you can come out swinging. But if you want to save your empire, it's time to make a move. The public needs to see you back at the helm." Trump gritted his teeth. He didn't want to admit it, but Roger was right. The longer he stayed out of the media's reach, the more they would chip away at his empire. The brand needed him. The world needed him. And in many ways, his family needed him too. But at what cost? Meanwhile, Trump's business empire was facing its own set of challenges. His absence had left a leadership vacuum, and the cracks were beginning to show. Investors were starting to get nervous. Some were calling for a restructuring, others were questioning the Trump brand's future in the luxury real estate market. One evening, Trump received an urgent call from his chief financial officer, Richard. "Sir, we've hit a point of no return," Richard said, his voice grave. "Some of our key investors are threatening to pull out if we don't make some major changes, starting with your public re-engagement. The stock has dropped, and the properties are beginning to lose value." Trump let out a long breath. He had always known that his public presence was tied to his business's success, but hearing it so directly stung. He didn't want to go back to the world he had distanced himself from. But with everything on the line, he was starting to wonder if there was any other choice. After days of internal struggle, Trump made a decision. He would return to the public eye, but on his terms. He wouldn't give up everything he had worked for. His family, his empire, his legacy. They were worth fighting for. But as the press started to buzz about his potential return, Trump realized that coming back wouldn't be easy. The media would be relentless, waiting to see if he could live up to the expectations that had been set for him. And even more so, he had to confront the part of himself that had long craved power, fame, and control. Was this a return to the Trump of old? Or had he truly changed, as he had hoped? Before making his final decision, Trump sat down with Ivanka once more. The tension between them had been building, and he could sense the growing frustration in her voice. "Dad, I don't understand," Ivanka said, her voice shaky. "You're the only one who can save us right now. If you don't step up, everything will collapse. I'm asking you to do this, for the family, for everything we've built." Trump paused, looking into Ivanka's eyes. He saw the same fire there that he had once felt, a burning desire to succeed, to make something of their name. But he also saw something else, fear. Fear of losing everything. Fear of losing him. "I know," Trump replied softly, "but I'm tired, Ivanka. Tired of the noise, tired of the spotlight. I've worked my whole life to be in control. But maybe it's time I give up that control." Ivanka's eyes filled with frustration, but she held her tongue. She had always respected her father's strength, his ability to lead, but she was also scared. Scared of losing everything they had worked for. "Don't give up on us, Dad," she whispered. Trump sat back in his chair, lost in thought. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. His decision could either save the empire or bring it crashing down. He knew there was no turning back. The day of his return to the public stage arrived. Trump stood in front of the cameras, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. The press was eager, the public waiting for his every word. As he stepped up to the podium, Trump's mind raced. This wasn't just about business. It was about legacy. About showing the world that despite his silence, despite everything, he still had control. "I've heard the critics, I've listened to the doubts," Trump began, his voice strong but measured. "But let me be clear, the Trump brand is not just a name. It's a promise. A promise of success, of leadership, of resilience. And I'm here to tell you that the Trump legacy is far from over." The cameras flashed, the crowd cheered, and for a moment, Trump felt the old surge of adrenaline. The world was watching him again. The empire was waiting for his next move. But even as the applause filled the room, a nagging feeling lingered at the back of his mind. Was this the man he wanted to be? Or was he just stepping back into the old role, the one that had always come with a price? Trump has returned to the public eye, but at what cost? The weight of his decision hangs heavy over him. Do you think he made the right choice? Or is he doomed to repeat the same mistakes of the past? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Trump stood before a crowd of thousands at the unveiling of a new real estate project, the kind of event that once made his heart race with excitement, but today, it felt strangely hollow. The press was snapping photos, the investors were clapping, and the world was watching, just as it always had. But Trump wasn't sure he cared anymore. The old thrill of being in the spotlight had faded. As he took the podium, his thoughts wandered, back to the quiet days he had tried to build with his family, away from the cameras and the endless cycle of public scrutiny. Those moments now seemed distant, like a dream that could never be fully realized. Could he really balance the legacy he had created with the life he now wanted? Or was it all just a game of illusions? Thank you, Trump began, his voice steady but lacking the usual fervor. It's been a long road, but today, we celebrate something truly special. This new project is not just another building. It's a symbol of strength, resilience, and the Trump name. The crowd cheered, but Trump barely heard it. His mind was elsewhere. As the event ended, Trump found himself alone in his office, staring at the glossy promotional materials that featured his face on every page. The images of him, larger than life, had once given him a sense of power. But today, they only served as a reminder of what he had sacrificed. The quiet life with his family, the peace he had longed for, and the chance to rebuild something more meaningful. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Ivanka. "Dad," she said, walking into the room. "We need to talk." Trump looked at her, sensing the tension in her voice. This wasn't just about the project, he knew that. It was about their family, about everything he had tried to fix, and everything he had lost. "Go ahead, Ivanka," Trump said, his tone heavy. "What's on your mind?" "I've been watching you, Dad," Ivanka said, her voice trembling with frustration. "You can't keep pretending like this is all okay. You came back for this. For the brand, for the empire. But what about us? What about the family? You promised us you were going to be there for us, to be present. But you've barely looked at me since you returned." Trump felt the sting of her words. Ivanka had always been his closest ally, his right-hand person. She had followed him through every battle, every triumph. But now, it seemed like his return to the spotlight had pushed her away. "I thought I was doing what was best for all of us," Trump said quietly, trying to defend his actions. "You and the others, you've been carrying this company for years. But without the Trump name, without the public attention, everything was starting to unravel. I had to come back, Ivanka. I had to." "I get it," Ivanka replied, her voice softer now, but still firm. "But you're not just a brand. You're my dad. And I'm not sure if you even realize how much you've changed since you stepped back into this world. You're not the man we all looked up to anymore." Trump's chest tightened. The pain of hearing his daughter say those words hit harder than anything he'd experienced in recent months. He had tried so hard to rebuild, to show that he could be both a leader in his business and a present father. But in the process, he had lost sight of the most important thing, his family. Just as the tension between father and daughter seemed to reach a breaking point, Trump's phone buzzed on the desk. It was Richard, his CFO. "Sir, we've got a problem," Richard's voice crackled through the phone. "There's been a scandal. One of our top projects is facing a massive setback. Investors are pulling out. The press is already picking up on it. You need to act fast." Trump's heart sank. The press had already been relentless, questioning every move he made. Now, the stakes were even higher. His business was under attack, and his return to the spotlight was starting to feel like a mistake. "I'll be there in an hour," Trump said, his voice sharp. He hung up the phone and looked at Ivanka, who was still standing silently in front of him. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes was enough. She was disappointed, yes, but there was also something deeper. She was worried. Trump arrived at the site of the troubled project to find his team in disarray. The construction had hit major delays, and the budget was spiraling out of control. To make matters worse, the media had already caught wind of the issue, and reporters were outside the building, snapping pictures, eager to get a quote. "Mr. Trump, what's your response to the growing concerns over the project's viability?" a reporter shouted, pushing a microphone toward him as he walked through the door. Trump froze, the familiar feeling of being under the microscope creeping back. He had been through this before, many times, but this felt different. This wasn't just about the project. It was about everything he had sacrificed to get here. His family, his peace, his inner calm. "I'm here to tell you this," Trump began, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We're not giving up. We've hit a bump in the road, but we'll get through it. We've built the Trump legacy on resilience, and that's exactly what we're going to show here. The Trump name is built on overcoming adversity." But even as he spoke, he could feel the doubt creeping in. Was this truly about resilience? Or was he just trying to save face, trying to prove something to the world that didn't matter as much as he once thought? That night, As Trump sat in his office, reviewing documents and taking calls from his advisors, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping away. His empire was crumbling, his family was distant, and his inner peace felt like a distant memory. He had returned to the spotlight, thinking he could balance everything, but it had only made things worse. Ivanka's words echoed in his mind, "You're not just a brand. You're my dad." The truth hit him like a ton of bricks. He had been so consumed by the desire to protect the Trump legacy, to keep the empire intact, that he had lost sight of what mattered most. The Trump name, the businesses, the public attention. It all meant nothing if he couldn't be there for the people who needed him most. The next morning, Trump made a decision. He was done. Done with the media. Done with the endless chase for validation. His family needed him. His children, his wife, and the people who had been there for him through thick and thin. He called a family meeting, and for the first time in years, he was completely honest with them. He told them about the toll that the spotlight had taken on him, about the pain of losing sight of what truly mattered. And he promised them something he hadn't in a long time, that he would be present, that he would put them first from now on. Trump walked away from the business, not in defeat, but in resolution. He handed over control to his children, trusting them to carry the torch. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. As he spent more time with his family, reconnected with the things that brought him joy, and focused on his own personal growth, Trump realized something. True legacy isn't built on buildings or power. It's built on the relationships you nurture, the love you give, and the peace you find within yourself. The world may never fully understand his journey, but Trump had learned the most important lesson of all. It's not the empire that defines you. It's the people you love and the life you lead. Trump has made his choice. He's walked away from the empire, from the public eye, and from the chase for power. Was this the right decision? Do you think he'll be able to find peace and rebuild his relationships? Or will the past always haunt him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. In the years that followed, Trump found contentment in a quieter life. His children continued to build the business, but they did so with a sense of purpose that had been missing before. And Trump, for the first time, was at peace. Not as the billionaire businessman, but as a father, a man who had finally learned that true success lies not in what you have, but in who you are. This concludes Trump fakes homelessness to sneak into hospital. Here's why. Thank you for following along on this journey. We hope you've enjoyed the twists, turns, and reflections along the way. If you'd like to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment with your thoughts.